Daniel Stone is used to acting with impunity, but one day he crosses the line by stopping the wrong woman. Now his career is in jeopardy, and he'll have to face the real consequences of his prejudiced actions. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to see how this story ends. And what do you think? What awaits the main character? Write your opinion in the comments. Officer Daniel Stone moved through the upscale streets of the city, his patrol car gliding effortlessly along the smooth roads. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the neatly manicured lawns, the well-maintained houses standing as a testament to the wealth and privilege of their owners. Daniel loved patrolling these areas. They made him feel important, powerful, in control. Here, among the affluent and influential, he believed he had a rightful place as the authority, someone who kept order among those who, in his mind, needed to be reminded of who was in charge. Daniel's reputation as a tough, no-nonsense cop had followed him for years. He thrived on the sense of superiority his uniform provided. It was more than just a job to him. It was a way to impose his beliefs on others, to assert his dominance in a world he believed was teetering on chaos. He had seen enough to justify his actions, or so he thought. The city was full of crime, and to him not everyone belonged in certain neighborhoods. As he cruised down the street, his eyes scanned the environment. Nothing seemed out of place, but Daniel had a knack for finding problems where others might not see them. His mind was wired to spot anything unusual, anything that didn't fit his rigid view of how the world should be. And then he saw it. A sleek black luxury car, its shiny exterior glinting in the sunlight. It wasn't the car itself that caught his attention, but the driver, a black woman. For a moment, Daniel's pulse quickened, and a familiar sense of suspicion began to rise within him. He didn't need to think twice. In his mind, a car like that, driven by someone like her, was enough of a reason to investigate. He flipped on his siren, feeling the thrill of control wash over him. The car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Daniel smiled to himself. Another routine stop. Another chance to remind someone of their place. As he stepped out of his patrol car and approached the vehicle, his mind raced with assumptions. He didn't know her story, but it didn't matter. He had seen it all before. Fancy car. Wrong neighborhood. Something wasn't right. He'd find out soon enough. License and registration, Daniel barked as he reached the window, his voice cold and devoid of any warmth or courtesy. The woman, seated calmly in the driver's seat, looked up at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no panic that Daniel was so accustomed to seeing. She moved deliberately, reaching for her documents without a hint of nervousness. This unsettled Daniel. He was used to people reacting with fear, with the kind of deference that came with authority. But not this woman. Her calmness irritated him. She handed him her license and registration, her movements smooth and composed. Daniel took the documents and began to scrutinize them, searching for something, anything, that would give him a reason to escalate the situation. He glanced at the address on the registration, noting that it was indeed a property in the neighborhood. Still, that wasn't enough for him to let it go. He'd already decided she didn't belong here, and he wasn't about to back down so easily. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, meeting his gaze without flinching. For several years, her calm, self-assured demeanor only fueled Daniel's frustration. He had expected her to be flustered, maybe even defensive. But instead, she was treating this as if it were just another routine stop. He wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to being met with composure when he exerted his authority. The control he sought was slipping, and it angered him. "Nice car," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yours?" "Yes, it's mine," she replied simply, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Daniel's jaw tightened. Her confidence felt like a direct challenge to his authority. He had dealt with people who tried to act tough or confident before, but this was different. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she looked at him with an unwavering gaze that rattled him. She didn't seem afraid of him at all, and that bothered him. "So, what do you do?" Daniel asked, his tone now carrying a note of condescension. He was fishing, looking for something to justify his suspicion. "You a lawyer or something?" "Yes," she said, still calm, still composed. "I'm an attorney." An attorney, of course she was. The irritation in Daniel's gut grew stronger. This woman wasn't just confident. She was someone who knew her rights, someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. But Daniel wasn't ready to back down yet. He couldn't just let this go, not when he felt like she was deliberately trying to undermine his authority. "I wasn't aware this neighborhood was a hotspot for luxury cars driven by lawyers," he said, the sarcasm evident in his voice. "You sure this is your car?" Her eyes locked with his, calm but unwavering. "I'm sure," she said. "I bought it with my money." The way she said it, so simply, with no trace of guilt or fear, infuriated him. Daniel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Who did she think she was, speaking to him like that? He was the one in charge here. He was the one who made the rules. But her calm demeanor, her refusal to show any sign of intimidation, was a direct affront to everything he believed in. "People like you," Daniel said, his voice growing harder, "don't usually drive cars like this. You sure you're not hiding something? Maybe you're just passing through, not really from around here." The woman didn't flinch. "I've lived here for years," she said firmly. "My house is just down the street." She gestured ahead, her calmness never wavering. Daniel glanced in the direction she pointed, but he wasn't ready to let go. His mind churned with the need to find something, anything, that would justify his growing anger. This woman wasn't giving him the satisfaction he craved, the fear he usually saw in the eyes of people he pulled over. Daniel leaned closer to the window, invading her personal space. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken hostility. He wanted to rattle her, to make her feel the weight of his authority, but she remained unshaken. Her calmness, her composure, was like a mirror reflecting his own insecurity back at him, and he hated it. "Maybe I should call your employer," Daniel said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "See if your story checks out. It wouldn't be the first time someone lied to me about their background." The woman didn't blink. "You're welcome to call," she said coolly. "I'm sure they'll confirm what I've told you." Her confidence was unshakable, and Daniel could feel the control slipping further from his grasp. He had nothing on her, nothing to justify the way he had escalated the situation. But still, he couldn't back down. "Not now. People like you," Daniel repeated, his voice now more aggressive, "don't usually belong in places like this." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened, as if she had finally decided she had heard enough. "People like me," she said, her voice steady, but now carrying an edge of steel. "What exactly do you mean by that, Officer Stone?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. The balance of power had shifted, and he was no longer in control of the situation. He could feel it slipping away completely, and with it, the authority he had wielded so freely. For a brief moment, Daniel considered backing down, ending the stop, and walking away. But his pride, his deeply ingrained need to assert his power, wouldn't let him. Instead, he took a step back, handing her the documents with a begrudging gesture. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice tight with suppressed anger. but don't think I'm not keeping an eye on you." The woman took the documents, her expression unreadable. Without another word, she started the car and smoothly pulled away, leaving Daniel standing by the curb, watching as the luxury sedan disappeared down the street. As he stood there, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, Daniel felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. Something about the encounter had shaken him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just that the woman hadn't shown fear. It was the way she had handled herself, the calm authority she had exuded, that left him feeling off balance. And then it hit him. She had known his name. Daniel's heart began to race as he realized the full weight of the situation. Whoever she wasn't just another random driver. There was something more to this, something he had missed. And as the unease gnawed at him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Daniel arrived at the station, but the weight of the previous day's encounter lingered heavily in his mind. The moment he stepped through the doors, a gnawing sense of dread had already taken root in his gut. His thoughts raced, cycling through every detail of the traffic stop with the black woman, replaying the subtle way she had turned the tables on him without even raising her voice. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That feeling only grew stronger when his phone buzzed with a notification, a summons to Captain Marcus Lee's office. Captain Lee was relatively new to the precinct, but his reputation preceded him. Known for his no-nonsense attitude and high expectations, he was someone who demanded order and respect in his department. He had been brought in to clean up the precinct after several scandals involving other officers. In many ways, he was the opposite of Daniel, strictly by the book, intolerant of any bending of rules. Rumor had it that Lee had personally chosen to take this position to set an example, to make the precinct a model of reform. Daniel had never crossed paths with him directly, but now he would have no choice. The air in the precinct felt different today. It wasn't just his own nerves. Daniel could feel eyes on him. His colleagues, though pretending to focus on their work, shot him furtive glances, and their whispers were quieter than usual. He wondered how many of them already knew why he had been called in. The station was a rumor mill, and it wouldn't take long for the word to spread. The walk to Captain Lee's office felt much longer than it should have. Every step echoed in the hallway, each footfall heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't going to be a routine meeting. Daniel tried to maintain his composure, straightening his uniform and pushing down the rising tide of anxiety. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Uncertain, vulnerable. He had always been the one in control, but not today. He reached the door to Lee's office and hesitated for a brief second before knocking. There was a long, tense pause before he heard the sharp, authoritative voice from within. "Enter." Daniel opened the door and stepped inside. Captain Lee was standing behind his desk, arms crossed, his face a mask of unreadable calm. He didn't motion for Daniel to sit. Instead, he simply stared at him, his piercing gaze making it clear that this was not going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Stone," Lee said, his voice as cold and steady as Daniel had expected. "We need to talk." The weight of those words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He closed the door behind him and stood at attention, waiting for whatever was coming next. But Lee didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, creating a palpable tension in the room that made Daniel's heart race. "I understand you conducted a traffic stop yesterday," Lee finally said, his tone even but carrying an undercurrent of something far more serious. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady. "I pulled over a vehicle for suspicion of—" "Spare me the details," Lee cut him off, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I already know what happened." Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about a routine stop. Lee's tone, his posture, It all suggested that there was much more going on here. A cold sweat broke out on Daniel's forehead as he realized that he was no longer in control of this conversation. "You pulled over a black woman driving a luxury car," Lee said, stepping around his desk and approaching Daniel with slow, deliberate steps. "You questioned her, accused her of being out of place, and escalated the situation to the point where it could have gone much further." Daniel swallowed hard, but before he could say anything in his defense, Lee continued, "Do you know who she is?" That was it. The question Daniel had been dreading, the one that had haunted him ever since the woman mentioned her husband. He didn't know her exact identity, but he had a sinking suspicion that the answer wasn't going to be good for him. "She's my wife," Lee said, his voice as cold as steel. The room seemed to shrink around Daniel, the weight of those words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Every muscle in his body tensed as the full realization hit him. His mind went blank. How could he have been so blind, so reckless? All the pieces fell into place. Her calm demeanor, her knowing glances, the way she had handled herself with such control. She had known exactly who she was dealing with, and now it all made sense. "Sir, Daniel began, but Lee wasn't finished. "My wife came home yesterday and told me about her encounter with one of my officers," Lee said, his tone still calm but now tinged with a barely restrained anger. "She told me how you stopped her for no legitimate reason, how you harassed her, insinuated she didn't belong in her own neighborhood, and all but accused her of being a criminal because of the color of her skin." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. His mouth was dry, and he felt a rising sense of panic as he struggled to find the words to explain himself, to offer any defense. But what could he say? Everything Lee was saying was true. "Do you have any idea how this looks, Officer Stone?" Lee asked, his voice growing harder with each word. "You stopped my wife, because of your own preconceived notions. You let your bias dictate your actions. And worse, you let that bias cloud your judgment to the point where you harassed an innocent woman." "I didn't know," Daniel tried to speak, but Lee cut him off again. "It doesn't matter if you knew," Lee snapped, his calm demeanor finally breaking. "You shouldn't have treated her like that, or anyone like that. No, this isn't the first time I've heard complaints about your behavior, Stone. But this is beyond anything I can overlook." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, and his mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out of this. He had faced tough situations before, had dealt with disciplinary actions in the past, but this felt different. This felt final. "I understand, sir," Daniel said, his voice strained. "You didn't mean what? Didn't mean to show your prejudice? Didn't mean to let your power get to your head? Or didn't mean to get caught?" Lee's eyes burned with fury, though his voice had returned to a chilling calmness. "You had no right to do what you did. And now, there will be consequences." Daniel felt the floor beneath him shift, as though the ground were crumbling under the weight of his own mistakes. Consequences. The word reverberated in his mind, carrying with it a sense of doom. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was hanging by a thread. "I'm not going to fire you, Stone," Lee said, his voice suddenly low, almost too quiet. "At least not yet. But understand this. You're on notice. From this moment on, every move you make, every decision, will be watched. I will be watching. One more mistake and you're done. Is that clear?" Daniel nodded stiffly, the enormity of what had just happened sinking in. This wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence for his career, hanging over his head like a guillotine. Any misstep, any sign of the behavior that had gotten him here, and it would be over. "Yes, sir," Daniel managed to say, though his throat felt like it was closing up. "I understand." Lee stared at him for a long moment, his eyes piercing through any pretense Daniel might have been clinging to. Then, without another word, He turned back toward his desk, signaling that the conversation was over. Daniel stood there for a beat, unsure of what to do next. The silence in the room was suffocating, the weight of his impending downfall pressing down on him like a vice. He had thought himself untouchable, above scrutiny. But now, standing in the office of a man who held his fate in his hands, Daniel had never felt more powerless. With a heavy heart, he turned and left the office, his mind racing as he replayed every word Lee had said. His footsteps felt hollow as he walked back through the station, the weight of the stares from his colleagues pressing down on him. They knew. They all knew. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Daniel went through the motions of his duties, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Lee, about the woman he had pulled over, and how easily he had let his biases take control. He had crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. As the hours ticked by, the tension in his chest only grew. Every glance from a colleague felt like an accusation. Every word spoken around him felt like judgment. He had lost control of the situation, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he would be able to recover. By the time his shift ended, Daniel felt like a man walking to his own execution. His career, his future, everything he had worked for was now teetering on the edge of oblivion. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. The woman had been right. Captain Lee had been right. Daniel had let his prejudice and need for control drive his actions. And now the consequences were catching up to him. As he left the station and walked to his car, the reality of his situation settled in. He was no longer untouchable. He was no longer in control, and that terrified him more than anything. The station was emptying out by the time Daniel left Captain Lee's office, but the weight of the conversation lingered like a thick cloud over his mind. He walked out of the building feeling drained, his thoughts racing but offering no escape from the sinking realization that his life, as he knew it, was hanging by a thread. Daniel sat in his car for what felt like hours, staring blankly out of the windshield. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. He couldn't shake Captain Lee's words, especially the threat of what was to come. "You're on notice. I'll be watching." That was more than a warning. It was a promise. Every move he made would be scrutinized from now on, and there would be no second chances. The drive home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. The silence of the road only magnified the chaos swirling inside his head. He kept replaying the encounter with Lee's wife, remembering every word, every glance, every decision that had led him here. He had let his bias, his prejudice, control him, and now he was paying the price. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was now at risk. All because he couldn't control himself. Because he had been too blinded by his own sense of superiority to see the truth. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the house was already dark. His wife, Sarah, was likely asleep, as she often was by the time he got home. Their marriage had been strained for years, a cold distance growing between them that neither seemed interested in fixing. Daniel had never really cared enough to try. But tonight, that distance felt heavier, more oppressive. As he stepped inside, the silence was deafening. Sarah was, indeed, asleep, a faint light coming from their bedroom, the only sign that anyone else lived here. Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the overwhelming isolation that had taken hold of his life. He didn't want to talk to her, and even if he did, he wasn't sure she would care. Their relationship had become mechanical, a daily routine of shared space but not shared lives. And tonight, more than ever, Daniel felt the full weight of his own loneliness. He collapsed onto the couch in the living room, not bothering to turn on any lights. The darkness suited his mood. His mind continued to spiral, jumping between the confrontation with Captain Lee and the myriad mistakes that had led him here. His thoughts lingered on Lee's words. "You're on notice. There won't be a second chance." Daniel had heard warnings before, but this time was different. This time, he knew there was no room for error. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His every move would be watched, every action dissected. His usual tactics, his domineering approach, his casual prejudice would no longer protect him. If he made one more mistake, it was over. His career would be done, his reputation shattered, and he would be left with nothing. The thought made his stomach churn. How had it come to this? In the quiet darkness of the living room, Daniel began to unravel the truth that had been gnawing at him all along. He had always believed in his own authority, in his right to control, manipulate, and assert his power over others. He had told himself that he was keeping order, protecting the community. But now, after being confronted with the consequences of his own actions, Daniel began to see the cracks in the image he had built for himself. He had been wrong, so very wrong, and now he was paying for it. The next morning, the weight of dread returned with even more force as Daniel pulled into the station parking lot. The usual hum of activity buzzed around him, officers coming and going. But Daniel felt out of place. He felt like a marked man, every glance from a colleague carrying a weight of judgment. Whether they knew about the incident with Captain Lee's wife or not didn't matter. Daniel knew that in their eyes, something had shifted. He wasn't untouchable anymore. As he walked through the station, the stares became more noticeable. Subtle glances, half smiles, whispers that stopped the moment he passed by. The rumor mill was turning, and Daniel was at the center of it. His actions, his career, his future, all of it felt like it was on the verge of collapse. Sitting at his desk, Daniel tried to focus on the paperwork in front of him, but his mind wouldn't let him. Every noise, every step, every conversation felt like a reminder of his precarious position. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken tension in the air. They knew. They all knew. He was no longer the powerful, untouchable officer he once thought he was. Now, he was just another man on the verge of losing everything. Hours passed, but they felt like years. Daniel tried to distract himself with work, but his mind kept drifting back to Captain Lee's office, to the woman in the luxury car, to every mistake he had made that had led him here. He could feel his grip on control slipping further and further away. And then, the inevitable happened. Near the end of his shift, Daniel was called back into Captain Lee's office. The summons came over the intercom, and for a moment, Daniel's heart stopped. He knew what this was about. He knew what was coming. He made the walk to Lee's office slowly, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. His palms were sweating, his mind racing with thoughts of what Lee might say, what decision might be made. The door to Lee's office loomed in front of him, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything that was about to happen. He knocked, the sound barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Come in," Lee's voice called out, calm but cold. Daniel opened the door and stepped inside. Lee was seated behind his desk, his face unreadable, his eyes focused intently on Daniel. He gestured for Daniel to sit, and for the first time in days, Daniel felt a cold sense of fear creep into his chest. "Officer Stone," Lee began, his voice steady, "we need to talk." The room seemed to shrink around Daniel as he sat down, the air heavy with unspoken consequences. He could feel the finality in Lee's tone, the weight of what was about to be said. There was no turning back now. "I've reviewed everything," Lee continued, his gaze never leaving Daniel's face. "I've looked over your record, the complaints, and the incident with my wife. And I have to say, it's worse than I expected." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. His mind raced, trying to find something to say, some defense. But nothing came. Lee wasn't done. "I've seen this pattern before, Stone," Lee said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "You've let your authority go to your head. You've abused your position, and now it's caught up with you." Daniel swallowed hard, the words hitting him like blows. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. "You're not the officer I need in my department," Lee said, his tone growing firmer. "And frankly, I don't trust you anymore. Your actions, your attitude, it's a liability." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that this was it. This was the moment everything came crashing down. Lee leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he spoke the final words. "You're suspended, Stone. Effective immediately, pending review. But I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you." The room spun around Daniel as the full weight of those words settled in. Suspended, his career, his life, everything he had worked for. It was over. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave the station today," Lee added, his voice cold and unyielding, "and don't expect to be back here anytime soon." Daniel sat there, unable to move, unable to speak. His mind was blank, his body numb. This was it. This was the end. Lee stood up, signaling the conversation was over. Daniel rose to his feet, his legs shaky, his hands trembling. He turned and left the office without a word, the silence of the station swallowing him whole. As he made his way back to his desk, the stares were back. The whispers, everyone knew. The entire station knew what had just happened. Daniel didn't care anymore. He was too numb to care. He gathered his things in silence, the weight of his gun and badge feeling heavier than ever. As he handed them over at the front desk, the finality of it all hit him like a sledgehammer. This was real. This was happening. His drive home was a blur, the streets and buildings blending together in a haze of despair. By the time he reached his house, the weight of everything had settled in his chest, crushing him from the inside. Sarah was in the kitchen when he walked in, but she didn't look up. She hadn't asked about his day in months, and tonight was no different. They moved through their lives like strangers, passing each other in the hallways, but never really seeing one another. Tonight, the distance between them felt insurmountable. Daniel collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of regret, anger, and fear. Everything was gone. His career, his reputation, his sense of control, all of it had crumbled. He had been wrong about everything. He had let his prejudice, his need for power, destroy him. And now, he was left with nothing. In the darkness of the living room, Daniel Stone realized that the battle he had been fighting was over. But the true fight, the fight to rebuild, to confront the man he had become, was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't sure if he was strong enough to face it. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes. We have many more stories like this. In the meantime, check out the other videos on the channel. We're sure you'll love them. Click on the bell to always be aware of new publications. See you in the next video.